and research with the state board. Again, good to see everyone. Joined by a few colleagues from the department and state board. So those folks, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, I'll start with Jennifer.
Good morning, Jennifer Nelson, Senior Director of Educator Preparation here at the Tennessee Department of Ed. Happy to be here. Good to see everyone.
Brianna.
Hi all, Brianna Summers, Director of Policy and Academics with the State Board.
Martha.
Good morning, Martha Moore, Senior Director of Educator Effectiveness for the Department of Education.
Catherine.
Hi there, this is Catherine Johnson. I'm the Communications Officer for the State Board.
Oh, I just hit the next page and I see we have a few more folks from the board and department. Nathan.
I'm Nathan James, insert interesting title here with the State Board of Education. So happy to be on.
Brooke.
Good morning. Good to see so many familiar faces. Brooke Amos, Assistant Commissioner for Human Capital at the department.
Erica.
Hello, everyone. I'm Erica Light, Director of Research for the State Board of Education.
Robin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Robin Ye, Director of Policy and External Affairs for the department.
Hey, did I miss anyone? Got a lot of boxes here.
I'm Senator Hensley, Joey Hensley. I'm on the Senate Education Committee.
Thank you, Senator Hensley.
Sorry, I was late. Bob Nardo from Libertas Montessori Charter School in Memphis.
All good, Bob. Good to see you all. All right, we have a whole
This is Holly Coleman, also, sorry. Holly Coleman from the Hyde Family Foundation in Memphis.
Hi, Holly.
Hi.
All right, we have a whole lot to cover.
Michael, I don't mean to interrupt. I'll get
good.
in here. This is William Slater. I serve in the House, Vice Chairman of Ed Administration Committee.
Representative Slater, good to hear from you. All right, folks, we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. Share my screen. Make sure I can still see folks. There we go. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes.
All right. So here's our agenda for this meeting. Welcome. Obviously, we're going to spend just a little bit of time recapping our previous meeting, which was all the way back in April 1st, which feels like forever ago, but also just like yesterday. Give a few updates on some things that have transpired between that first meeting and today. We will revisit clinical practice and NTPA requirements a bit, just to kind of ground everyone's understanding in those two topics. And then, similar to the last conversation, we'll dig into some key policy issues. So we'll talk about the internship, the length of the internship, coursework allowances during the internship clinical practice, frequency of evaluations, and clinical experience settings. Some topics that I know some folks on this call know very, very well and others may not. So please feel free to ask questions. There are no stupid questions at all. We've got a wealth of knowledge on this call. We've got EPPs, public, private, education-related organizations, school districts, everyone. So please be open to asking questions if you have them throughout. We will open it up to any other topics that you all have for discussion, and we'll move to next steps at the end. Okay, so our first meeting back in April, we provided some details about the EdTPA, and the reason why we focused so much on that, if you recall, was because in the summer of 2023, we conducted a survey of stakeholders across the state, and EdTPA was probably one of the biggest issues that was raised by those stakeholders as a potential barrier to entry for individuals seeking licensure in Tennessee. We discussed that stakeholder feedback. We explored possible policy shifts. So at the state board, we kind of always have this balance of needing to increase flexibility while maintaining a sense of quality and rigor and not feeling as though we are significantly lowering the bar and just letting anyone into the classroom. So where this group ultimately landed, your recommendation was to strengthen the requirements related to clinical practice, to provide a pathway for educator preparation providers to meet those requirements, to allow candidates completing this more rigorous clinical practice to be exempt from the EdTPA assessment, and to allow EPPs to maintain a less prescriptive student teaching clinical practice that does require completion of the EdTPA. Before we move on, are there any questions about that sort of recap? That was a very quick way to sum up a very lengthy and detailed conversation. Okay. Some updates. So what I did following that meeting, we had some internal conversations with board staff, with the Department of Education staff, and we kind of sorted out in order to move forward with this committee recommendation, because I think we all agreed that it was the right thing to do, what would need to change in rule and policy. And the first thing that we found in rule was related to tools that clinical mentors are using during that evaluation or observation in the clinical practice. Right now, that is kind of completely up in the air. It's up to EPPs to determine what tools are used as they evaluate teacher candidates. And so we added some language in a recommendation that went before the board in August to modify the rule. And that language is here before you. It says, beginning on July 1st, 2026, clinical mentors supervising candidates completing an internship clinical practice, that is the year-long clinical practice, as defined in Educator Preparation Policy 5.504, shall use an observation tool approved by the department. So that's the language that was presented on first reading to the board in August. It will go before the board on final reading in November. It's possible it may get tweaked, and we can come back to that, but I want to share just right out of the gate that there have been some recommendations to modify this slightly. So it is possible that we will tweak this language just a bit. In the interim, we've had ongoing meetings with department program and policy teams to discuss some of these issues. I presented with our board chair during a National Association of State Boards of Education office hours meeting just last week, where we had an opportunity to share the work of the Licensure Review Committee with other state folks across the country from state boards. We hosted a board member retreat just this past Monday, where we dove deeper into issues related to clinical practice and EdTPA, and I shared information about this committee with them as well. And I put November on this, but I'm realizing I've got my conferences mixed up because it is conference season. I don't know if that's true for some of you all, but it is that time of year. The NASB conference is not in November. It's actually next week. And so we will also have a presentation in Louisville next week to another group of state boards of education across the country, where hopefully we can get some feedback and gather a little more information about how other states are approaching some of these complex issues related to clinical practice and candidate assessment. Any questions before we move on?
Bob asked a great question in the chat about the observation tool as being designed to strengthen the clinical practice requirements.
Bob, great question. I would not say it is the move, but it is a move. It is one of many things that we are discussing. And in fact, the bulk of the time today will be spent on some of the other issues related to strengthening clinical practice. But yes, it is a move toward doing so. And some of that.
I have a follow-up. I wanted to hear that answer, but I do have a follow-up. It says unapproved tool. Is the department, are there tools the department will provide? And then also, is there a process that for existing tools that may have met acceptable criteria to be applied for upon approval?
Yeah, great question. So some of this comes into back to the conversation about potentially tweaking this language. There has been a proposal to just simply approve the team rubric for use for this purpose, which I think many EPPs are using that tool, and it would make a lot of sense, I think. There are potentially other tools out there, so it does seem right to leave the door open. But what I think we don't want, and I think the department would very much agree with this, is 47 different tools that are, submitted to the state for approval. that probably more or less cover some of the same things, but look a little different. And so that's the tweaking we'll probably see, is we will refine the language a little bit to clarify which tools are already kind of approved out of the gate. I'll also say that the reason why that date says July 1st, 2026 is to give the department some time, give EPPs some time to figure out what tools they plan to use. The department will need to develop a process for reviewing and approving. But again, we will likely have some guidance on the front end that makes it clear that there are some tools already out there that are approved. Brooke, Jennifer, anything else you'd add there, since this is kind of your world?
The one thing I wanted to add, whatever tool we use will have some validity and reliability built into it, so that it supports the EPPs as they go through comprehensive reviews and tracking data over time.
Good point. Any other questions? Great question, Dr. Stevens. I'm glad you brought that up. Jennifer and I had a conversation about this yesterday. My personal opinion is probably yes. If we do tweak this language, we should probably just point to the evaluation policy, but I don't want to say that with certainty because we haven't had very many discussions about the appropriateness of doing that. I like that.
I'd say those are in line with some of the internal conversations we've been having. But again, I think we're here to listen to the conversation today.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Bob. Okay. A little refresher on current policy for folks who may not be as well versed in some of these issues. So State Board rule provides the following definitions, and I am going to read this. I usually don't, but I'm going to in this case because I want to make sure everyone hears this information and fully internalizes the differences here, because they're kind of important. So clinical experiences. That means guided, hands-on, practical applications and demonstrations of professional knowledge of theory to practice skills and dispositions through collaborative and facilitated learning in field-based assignments, tasks, activities, and assessments across a variety of settings. Lots of words in that definition. Here's kind of the sort of easier way to think about this in my mind. Clinical experiences is that umbrella term that's used to define any activities that a candidate is doing during their preparation that puts them in a classroom setting, and that a school or a classroom setting, and that could be things like field experiences, right? So field experiences could look more like shadowing a teacher, observing, following them around, meeting with administrators, those sorts of activities. Whereas clinical practice, which is defined below, is student teaching, and this is the Tennessee definition. Student teaching, internship, or job-embedded opportunities that provide candidates with sustained school-based responsibilities, assignments, tasks, and assessments that allow a candidate to demonstrate the professional knowledge, skills, and dispositions to be an educator. I think the key word here is sustained. So this is where that candidate is in a classroom for an extended period of time, working alongside an effective mentor who is supporting their preparation. There's probably this balance of what they're learning in their coursework with the activities that they're doing in that classroom. But this is the more sustained clinical practice, and really what the bulk of our time today will be spent discussing. Interesting question. Could clinical experiences include teaching, training, tasks performed outside of a school setting, say in an adult workplace training context? I haven't thought much about that. I think it's a good question. Many of our EPP folks, do you have any other settings that you work with? And if the answer is no, is that something that would be advantageous, especially for certain, I'm thinking about career and technical education potentially.
Yeah, that's why I raised it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and even in a non-CTE context, in my corporate experience, there's a good deal of training that happens, particularly in large organizations, on a large nonprofit or corporate setting. So I thought, okay, is that it seemed analogous to what's being described in here in clinical experiences in the letter of the rule.
Yeah.
I also can see a situation if somebody is getting licensed in special education and is at a facility with older individuals
Mm-hmm.
and child centers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just wonder if that should say education based instead of school based.
Are we, Jennifer, just point me to exactly where you're referring.
So the last bullet, clinical practice, says opportunities that provide candidates with sustained school-based responsibilities.
I think we could add something that broadens this a bit. I think the only challenge is we want to make sure that they also spend a bulk of their time in a classroom. Pat, I could also see a situation where there are local nonprofits and other organizations directly supporting a school and district, and this prospective educator could spend time in those settings understanding the work that they do. But I think that's a interesting and good question. Megan.
Michael,
Yeah.
You mind if I chime in just for a second on that?
Sure.
Just one thing to keep in mind in terms of the creation of rule is how words can be interpreted differently by different readers. I mean, it's the thing to remember with rules is that rules are a delegated form of legislation. In other words, they have the force and effect of law because the legislature says we can create a rule about a particular thing. And so you always kind of have to think about when putting together a rule that, there'll be 7 different attorneys and 10 different opinions, on it. And so if you say education based and somebody later wants to interpret that to mean something entirely unintended, that can happen. And not to necessarily shoot it down, it's just there's a way you have to kind of think about how could it possibly be read whenever you're talking about rule changes. So
that's a good point.
That's my 2 cents. Thanks for listening.
And it runs to how specific either the statute is or how much detail you go into in the rulemaking process, doesn't it? In terms of defining the definitions.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just I was reading that thinking, okay, well, everything they're doing is education related, right? And so it'd be pretty easy for a dean at to look at that and say, well, what you're doing here is education related. It's related to your education, therefore it satisfies that language. So it's just it's always rulemaking is a bit of a minefield. So it's not to say the word changes entirely without merit. It just you kind of have to put yourself in a semi-paranoid way of looking at things whenever you're putting them into rule.
Yeah,
Michael,
Megan,
can I ask a clarification question?
Sorry, just one question. Megan's had her hand up for a little bit.
Okay.
Thanks, Michael. So how would these settings interact with the current non-public list of approved sites? So I'm thinking through when we have candidates who want to complete a clinical experience or job embedded placement at a non-public site, and we go to the listing that's currently on the DOE website and we look at the levels. If we're considering these entities that are not schools, how would that?
Yeah, I want to be clear. I don't think that there's a proposal to change where clinical practice can take place. That is, I don't think that would fly for a number of reasons. I think the question and proposal is, and I don't even know that it's necessarily a formal proposal, but it's one that probably applies more directly to field experiences, if that makes sense. I don't know if we are going to prepare an educator to be licensed in Tennessee, they are going to need some experience. And there are a whole host of other rules and policies that require this for them to work alongside a licensed and experienced clinical mentor. And most of those settings, or many of those settings, may not have that, which is not to say there's not value in them spending time in those settings, because I think there probably is. But we are not suggesting that your clinical practice could be completed in a outside of a public or one of the approved private school settings, if that makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you.
Ula.
My question was along those same lines. The way I read Pat's initial question, asking about clinical experiences, I understood that to be field experiences, not the clinical practice. Since the licensure is for the K through 12 setting, I guess it should be school-based and we wouldn't have to change it to education-based. But then if we just looked at other field experiences, that is a valid question to maybe look at. Could that also be, for example, in CTE, teaching at a TCAT, like a post-secondary setting, or other field experiences?
It's a great question. I think this definition of clinical experiences is broad enough that it could. So I do not see the word school. It says across a variety of settings. And so I think the intent there is that it could include locations like TCATs and workplace. And I think that would be a pretty great experience for a candidate to be exposed to some of those other settings and be able to make some of those broader connections beyond just their individual classroom. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving if that's all right. We have a host of questions to dig into. Before we do that, though, just a reminder on clinical practice types. Our rule and our policy require that all Tennessee approved prep programs must include one of the following clinical practices: student teaching, which has a 15-week minimum requirement. Candidates are not allowed to serve as teacher of record unless they're on a clinical practice permit, and it has to take place in 2 settings. I will just put a pin in that 2 settings piece. It has been a point of contention for a while, and we have a slide on it. We'll discuss it. So if that is something that is sticking out to you, just know that in a little bit, we'll spend some time on it. The internship, which is a full year of experience. Again, candidate cannot serve as teacher of record unless on a clinical practice permit. Has to take place in 2 settings. Job embedded clinical practice, 1 full year of experience. They are teacher of record. This is post undergraduate degree with a clinical experience in a second setting, meaning they don't have to leave their classroom and have direct teaching of another classroom. They have to have some field experiences that should actually say field experiences, I think, in a separate setting. So just to ground us in Tennessee's clinical practice pathways. We have pretty strong requirements for clinical mentors in Tennessee, which is a great thing. Every time I see a report come out about the best practices for clinical mentors, there's a lot of, yep, we do that, yep, we do that, yep, we do that. So that is a good thing. Mentors must hold an active Tennessee license with an endorsement in the area or closely related area where they will be supervising the candidate. Let me back up just a minute for folks who aren't clear on the term clinical mentor. This is the school-based mentor. So the educator who is licensed, who is teacher of record in a classroom and is directly supporting the teacher candidate as they're going through preparation. They have to have a level of overall effectiveness of above expectations or significantly above expectations. So that's a 4 or a 5 LOE in the prior school year, and they have to have a minimum of 3 years of experience as an educator.
How is closely related defined?
Great question.
To Nathan's point,
I don't know that it is. I think there's purposefully some latitude there. So you might, Jennifer, you probably have seen this a bit, or any of our EPP folks. What are some examples of areas where you've kind of had to be a little flexible?
Special ed.
Yeah.
Library.
Yes.
There's only one librarian.
Yeah.
CTE as well.
Yeah. So there's transferable skills. It's just a challenge sometimes to find someone. I would imagine you see it too in some of the really discipline specific areas like physics. Might be a challenge. Okay, EdTPA requirements. So again, EdTPA performance-based assessment. It is a pretty labor-intensive process. It is one that we introduced and began requiring in 2019, but many EPPs in Tennessee had been doing it since, I believe, 2010. So quite a while before. Tennessee has been kind of a leader on EdTPA. It is a strong assessment, but it is one, as we discussed the last meeting, that has posed some challenges for folks and may also be kind of misaligned to what districts are requiring of candidates. So EdTPA is still required for candidates completing a state-approved educator preparation program with a student teaching internship or internship clinical practice. It is no longer required for job embedded. And this was something we dropped fairly recently, given sort of the challenges that were faced by educators who were being evaluated by their principal, their administrator. They were doing the job, and also this TPA thing was sort of on the side, posing some challenges for them. So we are basically now coming back to this conversation and digging into that internship clinical pathway and saying, what would that pathway need to look like in order for us to feel comfortable removing that TPA there? Out-of-state educators can complete either the Principles of Learning and Teaching assessment or the EdTPA. The PLT is a multiple choice assessment, but kind of had to have some flexibility there because not every state requires or has the EdTPA pathway. Okay. Cynthia, this is a good note. When you say this requirement, just to be clear, can you tell me a little more about which one you're referring to?
Yeah, what, 2 or 3 slides ago, where you're looking at who's going to be the mentor teacher in the classroom for our student teachers interns. We've just seen a decrease. I'll give an example. Sometimes we're having to send people an hour and a half away from their home to find even closely related
So it's the endorsement piece that's a challenge.
Yes, and just there were a lot of early retirements, people who didn't intend to retire that early, but COVID gave them a little reason to go ahead and move out of the profession. It's become more and more challenging. And then there is some concern that some institutions have indicated that they're kind of just going with what the district said and not really checking their, dotting their I's and crossing their T's regarding this policy because it is so challenging.
That's a tough one, and I think in some cases has to be really driven by that partnership agreement and the work that the EPP and the district are doing on the front end to really define what strong clinical practices look like. But I don't know if anybody else has any other
I don't think it's
suggestions.
the practice. I don't think it's the clinical practice. I think it's just are there qualified mentors based on state policy. We've got high quality, and we follow it to a T, to the point that our students are just sometimes driving an hour and a half to find that qualified mentor.
So, I mean, let me ask this question, and it may be a stupid one, but as far as experience goes, that's probably not difficult to find, right? Folks who have 3 years of experience.
For some areas, becoming more and more complicated,
Really?
to be quite honest, Michael. I mean, it's the levels as well as the experience, both of those factors. And then school systems saying, shoot, we've got this person who'd be really great, but they're missing one of these things. And so they can't. So it is problematic at the moment, mostly due to retirements. And I see head nods, so I feel like I got an amen on that one.
Interesting. Okay, well, that's something we may want to come back to because that can get really complicated because this is best practice, but there is the reality of what's happening on the ground. Yeah, Bob. or whoever chimed in.
Mi- Michael, and also like it's oftentimes it's those mentors who are being asked to do the 1,000 other jobs in the school, and so
Yeah.
we run the risk of running like these people into the ground, like if we're not careful, and so like we could be contributing to like the teacher retention issues if we're not careful. So
That's a good point. I know we have had some conversations over the years about supporting mentors and recognizing them. Some states certainly pay stipends and that sort of thing. Obviously, there are challenges with that because you have to secure funding. It would be great if we had statewide funding to support clinical mentors because I think it would incentivize them to do this good work. And it means we would strengthen our pool of teachers coming into the profession. But right now, that is not the case. This so while we don't have a set aside time to really dig into these issues, we do have a slide at the end, just kind of anything that is bubbling up for you all that we would like to have during our next conversation or that we'd like to consider between first and final reading. So let's just kind of keep this one in the back burner as something we should continue discussing. Yeah, good point, David. Okay. All right, now it's going to get real heavy, and we're going to have a few conversations about some very specific and weedy topics. So okay, let me back up just a little bit. So just as a reminder, we're really looking at the internship clinical practice, and the idea here is that we would kind of redesign that, strengthen it, so that we can then say if an EPP has an approved internship, candidates completing that clinical practice do not have to complete the EdTPA. And so the idea is to strengthen it, to standardize some of it in order to feel confident about the quality of that clinical practice. So the first thing we're going to look at is the length of the internship. And this has been we've had a lot of conversations about words we're using here. So I anticipate we will have that conversation here, but the current policy says that the internship shall be for 1 full academic year with at least 100 days of the internship, including direct teaching experiences. So our proposed change, this is a draft for you all to review and react to, is the internship shall take place over the course of 1 full academic year. Candidates shall engage in delivering instructional content part-time during the first half of the internship and full-time during the second half of the internship. And field experience activities shall be completed prior to the beginning of the internship. So meaning those, going back to the discussion we had at the very beginning about field experiences, this full year would not be spent engaging in those types of activities. Candidates would actually be in classrooms, working alongside a mentor, engaging in direct teaching and delivering instructional content, small groups, large groups, full class. By the end, they should be delivering full lessons, potentially full days if that's feasible. But this is probably a structure that many EPPs have for their clinical practice. So I'd love to hear for those that you feel like you do have it. Is this rigorous? Is this feasible? Does the language seem intentional? For those who do not, what would be the challenges with this, and could those challenges be overcome?
I'll say
You started to go ahead. Someone else was go ahead.
I would say this, yeah, this looks like what we do right now for most of our non-job embedded candidates. I like the clause about the field experiences prior. A question that I'm thinking about as I read this, there at this point, there isn't language about different settings. And I know that that's elsewhere, but as we're thinking about the 2 semesters, is the intent for all of this to take place within similar settings, or is the intent to have 2 diverse settings?
Yep. Great question, and one that we will come back to. So let's set that aside and really just think about the part-time during the first half, full-time during the second half. and the one full academic year piece.
Yeah, you were getting into that, Michael, to describe like what types of activities might be done in a full-time iteration versus full-time, part-time versus full-time, but I am curious how that might be defined more fully, and then how we might be expected to demonstrate what qualified as part-time for the first half, what qualified as full-time. Is there, I mean, you were starting to give some activities like small groups versus a whole group instruction. Those were things obviously on a gradual release, but is there going to be a time allocation or like some submission? Like how, you know, I look at that and looking at our candidates' experience, which is currently classified as internship, but with these definitions actually starts to not be defined structurally. An internship or residency does start to be different because some of our gradual release, the full-time components would be in the first semester, for example, and some of our part-time components, and mostly they're part-time components because there's a gradual release, like that's the structure. But I could see that we might not potentially meet full-time during a second half, depending on how it's defined, because our residents are with a teacher of record the whole time. And that is, I'd just be curious for more definition there.
Mm-hmm.
And then how that will be, how we'd be justifying a candidate's completion of a part-time for a half and a full-time for another half.
So I have a couple thoughts, but then any of my colleagues, please feel free to chime in, because I'm sure you all have some thoughts as well. So we batted around the idea of saying something like at least 50% during the first half and 100% during the second, and that felt a little too prescriptive. Part-time and full-time felt more like it aligned with that gradual release of responsibility and gave some flexibility. Also, I batted around the idea of actually spelling out the types of activities, and I think that felt a little too prescriptive. But I do think this could be something that the department could provide some guidance on, or as you know, they're reviewing applications for the internship, that could be part of it. This, I will say, this would not be a candidate by candidate situation, right? It would be part of your program design.
Right.
So as you identified that a candidate completed an approved internship, as long as that internship was in fact approved under these criteria, then that candidate wouldn't have to complete a TPA. But I'll be quiet. Anybody, Jennifer or anyone else, have any additional thoughts?
Michael, this is
Yes,
Stacy.
Stacy.
Just a couple of things, and this doesn't answer this question, but one thing that's concerning to me is that this whole discussion seems to be around internship, and there are a world of EPPs that do not have an internship program. They have student teaching programs.
Yep.
And we had quite a bit of discussion about this at TACD. I guess I've got a couple of questions. When I look at what you've defined here in this proposed change, we have what we call a residency 1 and a residency 2 semester. Our residency 1 very much fits the definition of what you've got here.
Yep.
But if we're going to only consider these changes based on internship, I'm assuming that's going to mean any EPP that has a student teaching experience would have to submit SAPs. And we have 28 programs that we would have to resubmit if that's the case. I know that other EPPs have expressed that concern. So is there going to be any discussion around any changes that take place that be the student teaching component be considered also when we think about EdTPA? Or will everyone have to change to this model to, make this work if we want to see these changes?
That's a big question that we are just now starting to grapple with. And we received feedback. I'm sure you all are well aware of feedback we received from TACD membership, which was more direct than the last time we received feedback when the job embedded recommendations came out. So that is a point we're discussing. I'll be quiet for a minute though. I want anybody else kind of who's deeply engaged in this to give some thoughts on it.
Michael, this is Jennifer. Just a couple of thoughts. Right now, as it stands, EPPs have the opportunity to add internship or keep their student teaching. It's an EPP choice as of today, whether you go. And I know we've talked with you, Stacy, and other Grow Your Own participants, and did a special call to change your student teaching to internships. So um, I foresee a situation because we will have EPPs wanting to switch over, working with them to ensure that's done by the July 1st deadline.
And Jennifer, let me just ask this question. Would it require full SAP proposals to be resubmitted for every single program, or could there be a blanket, here's how clinical practice is changing for these X number of programs, as opposed to like a resubmission of every single program?
Yep. So we did a modified version of that just really focused more so on the clinical experience part.
Yep.
And I see us possibly tweaking that. There's some things that need to be tweaked, but we allowed that for EPPs and think that we'll probably do something similar to that. We do understand that there are EPPs that have lots of SAPs. And we will, again, work with them to get this all approved by July 1st.
So I think, Stacy, to kind of more directly answer your question, hopefully, right now the thinking is really just around internship, but we could find ourselves in a place where EPPs redesign clinical practice across the board to align to this, and student teaching becomes that student teaching, meaning the 15-week experience only, becomes a thing of the past. I think that's possible, but still an open discussion for sure.
Thank you.
Matt?
Ann asked another great question in the chat, looking at the field experiences being completed before internship. Some of those field experiences are likely embedded in coursework assignments and may not be completed in the summer before a fall part-time internship begins. So the question is, will candidates be completing coursework during the year-long internship, or is that not an option?
Yeah, so that is the next slide, actually. So we will spend some time talking about that, though I think you're raising a question, like if our language is so prohibitive that it says you cannot do field experiences during that, maybe we don't want that, right? As long as you are engaged in clinical practice during that first semester, we probably don't want to say you're not allowed to do any field experiences. Any thoughts on that? Because that could include things like what Pat raised earlier about, going out and spending some time with some of the community-based organizations or that sort of thing. I don't think we want to limit that.
And that's not the way the bullet point is written, but that is the interpretation, because if I shall complete it, it's almost as like complete means done. So there's a difference between completing things and having adequate experience with things. So I think, I'm sure that we all embed field experiences in our coursework. Yep. And this does really start to cause us all to think structurally about our programs. And I think that's what we're all thinking about.
Yeah, good point.
Michael, I just want to address David's question. The intent is for the academic year to start in the fall and end in the spring.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I had two kind of notes. I think some of the language or I think internship predates some of the residency push. Have we considered like some other states to codify like a true residency pathway? And I think like separating the two could be really helpful here. Because I think like as I read this, it really narrows some of what we are defining as a residency.
Great question. I remember conversations years ago where we were trying to to do this, and it proved to be very difficult. And part of that is because from my recollection, though there are folks on this call that are probably way more versed in this than I am, the national definition of residency it included a whole lot of things that I think some programs are doing that define their clinical practice as a residency and others might not be doing. And so we could potentially do that. I think, this whole idea of using internship as the clinical practice umbrella for residency has its pros and cons. But anyone else have any thoughts on that? If we tried to define residency,
Yeah, as a residency model, I'd love to speak into that and appreciate you bringing that up, Matt. I think as I look at these, like the internship, and I really feel some solidarity with Stacy. Like there's definitional challenges to current practice that may be really strong that we don't want to lose, and there may be structural challenges that help us align more appropriately together to produce great candidates. So I think that's tricky. But I think you do have now, I don't know how long ago that conversation was about residencies, but I do think you have some residency practice in the state that it could be a different conversation at this point to be able to define the minimum requirements for a residency in the state of Tennessee. And I really advocate for the group, the Tennessee Department of Ed or the board to consider that, only because as I look at this, the challenge becomes to the mentor teacher in a residency experience. Like when I look at how those graduate release experiences for the candidate here, part-time, full-time, I'm thinking about how does this impact the work and the employment of somebody who that is their full-time classroom. This isn't job embedded. This isn't student teaching boundary that way. Like I do think we are considering a couple of stakeholders here when we're making some definitions. And that is a key difference to consider.
I was just going to echo that. I like the idea of exploring what a residency is. We partner with several residency programs, and but at the same time, I don't want to kind of lose our student teaching. Vast majority of our programs are internship, but by design, our math and science also kind of do student teaching, because some of them are still thinking about, do I want to go in the lab, for example, and are really kind of pursuing both potential graduate school to be those math and scientists and or maybe go in the classroom. So yeah, just wanted to kind of share those 2 points. And kind of agreeing with Cynthia Chambers. I'm echoing your call on that too. We're seeing more and more students starting college with some college credit and finishing a little bit earlier or getting ahead. And so sometimes we're seeing like, hey, I'm done and ready to start an internship in spring. And I understand, I really prefer the opening and closing of the school. And but a lot of times then we're just pausing them to start coming in fall. So haven't really sorted out any potential solutions in that, except, take fewer classes, but that's a hard sell.
Well, David, is that happening because of the dual enrollment?
Yeah.
Stuff that, so
that you want to encourage.
Yeah, it's all the good stuff our high school friends and our P12 partners are doing. It's all that good stuff.
It's got federal financial aid implications. They can't just sit and wait like they used to or take other stuff. You can't take extra, you can't even take add-ons.
Yeah.
It's not within their programs of study. And so they can't do something else while they wait for fall. And so if you say you have to wait or you have to pay out of pocket to make it happen, then students are going to change their majors. It's just inevitable.
How many, what percentage of students are we talking about here?
Ours is pretty small. I mean, we're talking about 10-ish. Yeah. So in terms of
out
our
of
size,
how many?
About 10%, I would say overall.
Okay.
But these are sometimes your top students, like David mentioned. These are your students who were gung-ho in high school, taking a bunch of classes at the college level. So you're talking about top-tiered students that are a part of that 10 he mentioned.
And I'll mention, Cynthia, I'll underscore that it's also those math science disciplines that
I think that's something we'd have to talk about on the side. Thinking about sort of what is the sort of gold standard? What is the most appropriate approach for a candidate to be able to see the impact of their experience and their direct teaching activities on student learning and growth would really be for them to see that full school year and not a disjointed piece. But given that there is maybe some unintended consequences, we should definitely have that discussion as well, what that could look like, whether that's some sort of approval process at the candidate level or exception or something like that. I don't know. But as far as policy goes, I think we probably want the norm to be fall and spring. All right, we're getting a lot of questions too.
Michael, to David's point, I think like having the two would probably like an internship, like for the student teaching place, like having a true like student teaching and residency. I think having two of those would probably clear up some of the confusion and provide like clear, distinct pathways for folks. I think that could be beneficial. The other piece that I just wanted to name is that like anytime we talk about like time and like the focus is on time, I worry that we're shifting away from like the focus being on the teachers, like teacher quality and like the teachers and proficiency. And so like, you know, as we think about, and this is me talking from a alternative pathway and, you know, paraprofessionals who are coming to us with, you know, years of experience, like some of them are ready that first, like they could take over a classroom after that first quarter. And like they're great teachers. And so like, you know, does that mean that they can't, like they have to continue doing some of these part-time experiences and they have to wait? And so I think I would love to see a shift to like the proficiency of the candidate versus like time constraints. And I think that could be really impactful just on like, then that would shift the conversation to students as well.
That's a really good point. A couple thoughts on that. I think at this, if we have more of a standardized process for evaluation, it gives us a tool and structure to be able to look at things more like proficiency. Because right now, if we were to add some sort of proficiency definition, it would probably be a bit all over the place and be driven by whatever the EPP is using, if that makes sense. I had another point and it totally just slipped my mind. Oh, on the residency definition, I think, and please chime in for the folks, because defining residency again, I think would be a challenge in Tennessee, especially when, in my mind, we've got these programs who are using the internship umbrella for the residency program, but in a lot of cases, the true residency model kind of goes above and beyond what the internship minimum requirements are. So I don't know, from a communication standpoint and from a clarity standpoint, it makes a whole lot of sense for us to add residency in there. But at this point in time, I think that would pose some like we would need to spend a good chunk of time talking about what is the difference between an internship and a residency model, such that we feel confident including that language and codifying it in policy, because then what it also means is any EPP that is not meeting those minimum requirements for the residency would need to reclassify that residency as something else. And so I just want to kind of throw that out there, that I think this is an important conversation to have around, you know, defining residency, just not an easy one. Which is not to say let's not have it. It's just let's kind of maybe focus on that one in a different meeting. But please push back if you think we need to do that right now. Let me sift through some of these comments and see if there's anything else. I know I saw one.
Michael, while
yes.
you're looking through there, I just wanted to give a shout out to Representative Slater. They passed a law, Public Chapter 284. And I guess this kind of ties in with my concern that Stacy also has about Ed TPA only being for internship and not student teaching. We've had issues with Public Chapter 284. What that allows the commissioner to do is to issue a temporary license, teaching license for student teachers, as long as they've completed all their coursework. Well, that's great for us because we get a teacher of record, and that's great, and the student teacher also gets paid. However, some of the things that we've run into is that not having all of their coursework. So I just want to make sure that I go on record saying that internships are great. I think they're good, but I want to ever what can happen on the EPP side to try to get their coursework done so that we can employ them as a teacher of record and they can get paid would be preferable from us having to try to work with and get teachers in our classrooms, because it is, like many of you all mentioned, it's getting difficult finding qualified teachers for mentors, just like it's difficult getting teachers in the classroom. So I just don't want this push to push everybody going into internships, and then we have less student teachers that we could utilize Public Chapter 284 for.
Hey, Eddie, I'll just remark on that as well. I mean, part of the reason that this conversation and frankly this committee, this step back is so important is because a lot of times the legislature, and certainly Senator Hensley and Representative Slater, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of time they're brought certain anecdotes and 4 or 5 circumstances and changes, and kind of led to believe that really suits all the districts across the state and all the circumstances. And it doesn't. And sometimes we end up with this patchwork. That particular bill you're talking about was based on Representative White's experience back in the I always called it the Representative White in the 70s bill, because that when he first became a teacher, and there were certain ways you could go about and do some of those things. But this point you're making here, I think, is so important for our legislators to hear. And that there's always a lot of different sides of the pancake, no matter how flat it might be. So I just appreciate you making that point, and also, frankly, that every time you pull it a different way, there are quality implications there. And what the board's responsibility is to always walk that tightrope, right, of accessibility in a very tight labor market, versus also the fact that our reports of educator misconduct keep going up year over year, and we can't pretend that those things are not related to each other. So it's a tough business. I think it's a very, very well made point.
I will just add to that conversation that the clinical practice permit, and any permit, is truly an emergency credential. And I think as we talk about kind of structuring clinical practice and when coursework is taken and how candidates are supported, similar to this conversation about residency, including folks who are paraprofessionals and have deep experience already in the classroom. Personally, I see some of these as kind of sitting outside of the core of the conversation that impacts the majority of candidates who are pursuing a license, and not necessarily some of these other kind of cases that are a little, I don't want to call them fringe, because they are becoming increasingly more common, but some of the more kind of emergency situations or more advanced situations where we're dealing with folks who are a little different from the standard pathway. There was a comment, in fact, looks like John is rejoining. I just want to clarify, from a school perspective, what is the impact on the teacher shortage if we eliminate student teaching and go to a residency? I just want to clarify that is not the proposal to get rid of student teaching. So that would not, that is not being proposed at this time to eliminate student teaching. I think the conversation, though, and I just based on what everybody's saying, having this in the back of your mind as we go through these additional recommendations, are you all leaning to a place where we should just have one clinical practice pathway? If all of these things could apply to that clinical practice, should we do that? Setting aside the conversation about residencies, because I think that's a slightly different one, but I just want to kind of highlight that. Yeah, Cynthia, the job embedded conversation and some of the discrepancies there. My former boss wrote a dissertation that was focused on whether job embedded programs or alternative pathway programs were emergency certification pathways, and I think that question still kind of looms around. You know, we're providing job embedded folks with a pathway to get in the classroom pretty quickly without some of these sorts of quality experiences, and I was one of those individuals myself. Whereas we're really beefing up, I think that is a difficult one. And one that if you can kind of think through some of the sort of policy implications, how do we strengthen that job embedded practice? I highly doubt there's a world where we get rid of it. And I don't know that anybody would advocate for that. But what
I wouldn't advocate for it, but we have right now with the clinical practice permits, they're held almost to a higher standard and they're at the end of their program. They still have to do EdTPA. They now are in their first year of teaching, and just what we're hearing from districts, specifically academic coaches, is those students are far more prepared going in than our job embedded candidates who are overwhelming them.
Yeah.
Michael, I'd like to just remind this group that, and I've told you this before, we are seeing several students. The students have gotten smart now, so they can see that if I finish all my coursework, it would be easier for me just to graduate and get a job on a job embedded pathway just to avoid EdTPA.
Yep.
And that's becoming increasingly more and more among our students. And so I think the concern I have as we continue to go through this, I'm anxious to hear what all is laid out, is that this process is great, and I agree that we need to have it to be rigorous and intentional in our approach, but I feel like we're just adding another layer of something that we're going to have to all do and make work, and it's not going to work for all programs, and we're not really going to end up maybe helping our students the way that we need to in the immediate. The concern is right now our students are struggling, and not just because I don't want them to do EdTPA. EdTPA is a great assessment, but because they are not getting the experience they need. The majority of our candidates do their student teaching component in the spring. We have close to 180 to 100 every semester. They're so focused on EdTPA, the first part, they don't get the experience they truly need. And then by the time they get to that second placement, then the schools run testing, and so they don't get the experience that they really need. So I feel like if we didn't have this huge assessment for them to worry about, we could really come up with something else and just keep our internship if that's what we like, or keep our student teaching if that's what we like, and then find something else, whether it be we utilize team and have some parameters around what that expectation is. We need to do something rather than, I think, try to have to go back and reinvent the wheel for some of our programs just to negate having to do EdTPA. That's just my opinion.
Well, let me ask this question. Do folks think we should just drop EdTPA for all clinical practice pathways? Not separating the conversations around, some of the specific things we'll talk about here in a moment related to clinical mentors, but let's just ask that question.
I would say so. I think that this has the potential of creating the same type of situation that the drop of EdTPA for job embedded did, in terms of the inconsistencies or just the options that teacher candidates have, and it doesn't take long for them to figure out how to work around. And if EPP is not able to adapt quickly to an internship, that they don't have, what happens with the students between having the job embedded option and potentially getting connected with another institution. I will say that I recognize that the CPP is intended to be an emergency credential, but the truth of the matter is, in our fall group, and I also in the conversation about, having a fall to spring intention, this fall we have nearly 70 candidates. Those are all candidates who are off of the traditional kind of timeline for their degree. And so I think that's something to consider in terms of the impact of requiring a fall start and a spring finish. We have a number of students that would impact. But this fall, I have 15 teacher candidates on a clinical practice permit in their student teaching. Last spring, I had nearly 25 candidates on a clinical practice permit during their student teaching. And those are all students that our district partners had a need for right now. And there are so many things that they're balancing. There is an inequity in the expectations in terms of different schools approach their evaluations and observations differently depending on when they start. But as an EPP, we're held to keeping them to the same standard of our other candidates and trying to manage those differences. So my concern with this focus on the change of EdTPA specifically for the internship is kind of a combination of all of the challenges that everyone has mentioned, and the fact that for some EPPs, all of those challenges might come up at the exact same time. I understand that for some, it could work with a small tweak, and with some, you know, it would be off the table for a while. But everything that has been brought up as a challenge to this, I could see impacting our EPP immediately because of the variation of our candidates and our programs and all of those things.
Other folks, I see some people in the chat, but I want dissenting voices to be heard too. Because just a short while ago, we had a memo from TACTI that said that the contingency was pretty much split 50-50. But I do want to note that I think that part of the reason that was the case for the folks who wanted to keep it is that they were concerned about sort of the inequitable pathways to licensure, and so just want to be kind of transparent about that.
Michael, most of the people here run much larger programs than we do, but from our last few years of experience with both job embedded and internship perspective, I would just respectfully say that while I agree with some of the comments that there's quite a lot of merit in some ways to EdTPA, I would say that we feel really confident that the field experiences we have designed for our folks are effectively preparing them. The job embedded pathway has also given us a chance to reduce barriers to access to bringing people from different backgrounds into the profession, and they're moving forth and moving the needle for kids. And so I think that there is a sort of rigorous pathway through that job embedded experience that could allow us to consider ways that some of the testing requirements can be, again, while not sort of attacking some of their merits, nevertheless sort of burdensome for some people. And so I think the possibility of more flexibility and more pathways around the assessment for folks in a place like I am, you know, in an urban setting, you know, trying to bring people into kind of a different approach and pathway, I think would be really desirable if that could be considered. Thank you.
John, I see you have your hand up.
Hey, from a principal's perspective, and I hire every year your graduates. I have yet to ask a student how they did in the EdTPA or anything in that manner. I'm more worried about what I see through their internship, calling their teacher that they did an internship with, talking to a long-term or their student teaching. That means more to me than the EdTPA. So I know we're talking a lot about, and that's a barrier to entering the profession for a lot of people. If they start talking about that, and I hear it from my interns that they get all worried about and worked up about their EdTPA, and I'm like, I've seen them teach all year long. I know whether they're a good teacher or not. I know whether I want to hire them or not. And I know whether I want to recommend them or not, regardless of an EdTPA. So just, you know, from my perspective, we've got a team evaluation system or Team Tiger, whatever your district's on. That I think really does a good job of helping us categorize and collect data on good teachers and good young teachers.
That's an important perspective. All right, I want to pause for a moment and just pose this question because on April 1st of this year, this group convened, and one of the proposed policy recommendations was to drop EdTPA entirely. And this group did kind of say, well, let's have the option, right? Let's create this one pathway of more rigorous clinical practice, no EdTPA, maintain another pathway that requires EdTPA. Does this committee now believe that you would recommend to our executive director dropping Ed TPA, not setting aside these additional conversations we'll have in just a moment around kind of creating some more structure around clinical practice and mentoring. But I just want to put that out there. Megan.
Yeah, I can offer, and I've certainly been at this far less than some people on the call, so I appreciate the learning I get from this group. I was hesitant to drop. It seems like the right incremental move, yes, forward to drop Ed TPA. Like that seems like a no-brainer to me. I think the challenge of committing to that is what are the next steps then that the department would propose or that we would come up with that does help us navigate quality metrics that are consistent across a licensure pathway. And that feels stressful to like say in this like we've had a good conversation about the differences of program structures inside of an individual pathway. So it, yeah, I mean, it seems like I could vote a different way on Ed TPA, but I'd be curious to know what the outlay is to help that would come from the department or that would come from this group recommendation. And I get that that's what this conversation was. And so that's where we drill into details around part-time, full-time, time allocate. Yeah. Yeah. And what David's typing. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I am not hearing many dissenting voices there. So if you are, or any, I say many, not hearing a single. If you are kind of feeling kind of uneasy about that and want to share your perspective offline, please feel free to send me an email. Let's do this just to shift a little bit. So we have, I think, 3 other topics for conversation. Does it make sense to you all to go through these? And if, like, for example, this one that's on the screen right now really would just apply to the internship, right? If we maintained a student teaching practice, we'd have to think differently about how do you strengthen that student teaching practice. Setting aside Ed TPA, right? If Ed TPA was no longer required for any clinical practice pathway, this language would just apply to the internship. And I think all it really does is it clarifies what candidates can do or should be doing in the first half versus the second half, and when they have to do field experiences. So it doesn't do a whole lot, right? But let's move on to the next one, which is around coursework. There's already a requirement, a prohibition on coursework being taken during student teaching. So let's set that aside for a moment. The proposal here would be that candidates may take coursework for internship, may take coursework during the first half of the internship while engaging in clinical practice activities, but may not take additional coursework during the second half of the internship. I feel like that kind of aligns with current practice for the most part, but please speak up if that's not accurate. And the idea there is that during the first half of the internship, candidates would complete coursework that integrates both clinical practice activities and curricular content. It seems to me to be best practice to have sort of that balance where candidates are spending time in a classroom, applying what they're learning in their coursework, and they're coming to their courses and they're sharing some of what they have been engaged in during their clinical practice activities and making those direct connections. Does this seem like a reasonable approach? And does it allow enough flexibility for candidates to complete programs in 4 years, being mindful of candidates who have to work to sustain themselves? Does this language adequately do that?
Yes, I think so. Currently that is how, I mean, we had internships since the 80s. I mean, that's how we've always operated, that we're teaching our pedagogical courses during the opportunities for students to practice and coach and get that good mentorship. That I feel like is important. As we moved from, a 4+1 accelerated master's into a 4-year, what functionally some of the challenge becomes in, because we also want these candidates to have early experiences during their first year, sophomore year. And so there's sometimes, especially in our world language, or even some of our math and science, where they could be still taking some of those content courses during the last semester or during that internship year. So they are usually at that point maybe taking a pedagogical course, but there also could be, like again, in the world language, in those areas, taking a content course too. Just because we want the early experiences as well before they get to that senior year, junior year, and we have a clinical experience and they go, oh, teaching is not what I thought it'd be. So, but for the vast majority of our programs, they're just taking those kind of how to teach pedagogical kind of courses during the internship. But we do have, again, some of those secondary endorsements that, we really want them to have robust experiences, quote, in the arts and science, in English, in math, in science. So, just needed some of that space to do everything.
Thanks, David. Megan? Nope, you're muted, Megan.
Thank you. It's helpful to hear a comment, David. It reminded me to name internship is different at the graduate level. So currently we're a residency model of preparation categorized as an internship licensure pathway only existing at the graduate level. And so currently our structure matches this summer, fall, spring iteration, but we have the 35 credit hours that everybody else does for the state. And it would blow our program up for a graduate to complete in 3 terms, to have to do that coursework in 2. So just structurally, again, this is what brings me back to what is it, and then it makes me think about, like, a residency is potentially an internship model at an accelerated pace or a different intensity pace. And I don't know what that's like at the undergraduate level. So it was really helpful to hear. And, this timing, as Matt was talking about, is going to be very challenging for alternate, accelerated, or graduate level programs.
And in the one residency we kind of work with, and I'm not even, and I don't know enough about residencies. That's where I'm hoping to learn a lot more from you and Matt, and as I'm dipping more into this space. But our model is just kind of stuff they do. I don't want to call it internship, but basically they're opening and closing the school in a practicum field experience. And then they pivot to job embedded year 2. And so in both those models, they're able to take coursework concurrently. So they still become a teacher of record in a pretty quick way, that our districts really value. But they're getting both that support at the pre-service and in-service level. But I don't know if that meets, like I said, I have not been to the national residency conferences lately and need to learn a lot more to learn.
And I think it's different for different residencies I'm learning in the state, but I can name for us that our teachers are never the teacher of record. So our teachers never shift into job embedded. So it is this when I come to these conversations, I'm really listening and finding a lot of synthesis with our student teaching colleagues. And because it is very much inside someone else's classroom to learn. I'm also really, finding synthesis with internship when it's not job embedded, but our people are never job embedded. So that does make it, there is a nuance here. Again, I'm not trying to take us back to residency. I don't care for a different category, but I do think there is a group inside of internship that is unique, whatever we're going to call them.
How do you all meet this is just my ignorance, how do you all meet the 100-day requirement for
Our
internship?
residents are in a mentor teacher's classroom Monday through Friday, every single week of the year, starting with in-service.
And then when do they do coursework?
I'm sorry, Monday through Thursday, and they're out on course. They do coursework Fridays. So our residents are clocked. So Monday through Thursdays, we are at minimum 1,700 contact hours for direct service in classrooms. So, yeah. So structural, I mean, Monday through Thursday in a mentor teacher's classroom, not as the teacher of record, almost as a student teacher. Fridays, some Saturdays coursework. You know,
Excuse me, similarly, similar design, except for our coursework is evening.
Okay. Okay, so it sounds to me like this is not necessarily a bad proposal, but we would need to be considerate and mindful of the way that some of our residency programs are designed in particular.
yeah, it really doesn't seem to be a quality challenge, but it will be a structural challenge the way this is written for us to operate.
Can you, coming back, hold on, just 1 second real quick. So Megan, you mentioned something about 35 credit hours as a state requirement. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Okay, probably is not a state requirement. We are inside an institution of higher ed, and so I guess the accreditation for the master's degree, we culminate in a master's degree.
Got it.
So at the graduate level, that is the confounding variable.
Got it.
And David, you
Megan,
got
ours
advice
is
for me,
20.
I would take it.
Megan, ours is 24.
Okay, well, and so this is licensure plus a master's.
Yes, ours is licensures plus a master's.
And so we are, it used to be closer to that. It is not right now. So again, I'm talking structure, and there's flexibility clearly with that comment in credit hour design. But in terms of real life seat hours and the content people need, I was here when we were at another institution and 24 was sufficient. We migrated to another institution and 35 was sufficient. And I'll be honest, we always need more time with our candidates in terms of content. So again, when it's just a year, so it doesn't, it's just, I'm just naming the structure, and I appreciate anyone listening and hoping this helps our conversation around structure advance.
Megan, just to clarify, when I say 24, we lean into a competency-based model where then students can, through a proficiency exam, be awarded university credit, and we're able to transcript that, which keeps costs down and keeps things moving a little bit quicker with greater flexibility for those adult learners that we were finding.
Because we have, some states have a minimum credit hour requirement for licensure programs, and I don't think anyone in this state has any interest in moving to that. We are, of course, more standards based, and we've got district prep programs. We've got some on the call who are able to meet that standards requirement. But then I think we also recognize there are degree granting requirements that just be transparent, I don't know a whole lot about, that you all know way more about in that regard. Somebody just raised their hand. Bob.
I don't want to belabor the point, but I just wanted to draw your attention. I made a comment with a couple of details about some of how our program works that I think also could be a little bit problematic, if I'm understanding correctly, a potential prohibition on, quote, second half coursework. So just wanted to chime in from a quote residency standpoint about that as well. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear and helpful. Let me move on to the next one. All right, so in light of the recommendation that I think is coming from this group, let's look at this one through the lens of any clinical practice. Does that make sense to you all? Because it just kind of, again, taking a big step back here, if you all are recommending dropping a TPA, I would assume then any conversation about increasing rigor of clinical practice would not just be for the internship. It would be for every clinical practice. Are we in agreement there? Cool. Okay, so the current policy around frequency of evaluations, we've got some language in policy that says EPPs shall require formal evaluations and feedback opportunities for candidates completing clinical practice from the EPP clinical supervisor and clinical mentor. For those who aren't clear, the clinical mentor is that school-based support. The clinical supervisor is the EPP-based supervisor and individual who oversees multiple clinical practice placements. The proposed change, and this comes, I know we've met, well, I think we've mentioned this, I shared it with you all, that's what it was. The NCTQ clinical practice framework, I personally thought was very strong. NCTQ seems to be in a slightly different place these days. And I thought that that was a pretty strong guide. And so this language comes from that, but I wanted to pose it to the group. Clinical mentors and clinical supervisors shall formally evaluate. Let me pause for a moment on the word evaluate. We had this discussion. Jennifer and I had a really robust discussion about this, the word evaluate versus observe, and felt that formally evaluate was a better word to use, because observe is just quite frankly kind of weak and could mean a lot of different things, and evaluate adds some strength to the experience that is more akin to what they would experience once they are in their own classroom. So clinical mentors and clinical supervisors shall formally evaluate candidates using a department-approved evaluation tool a minimum of 5 times during the, and let's just say during the clinical practice. Evaluation data shall be used to support developmental feedback while the candidate is engaging in direct teaching activities. Discussion questions. Do you believe 5 is sufficient? Is it too much? Should we remove the number and align with new teacher pacing guides, which I would point some of my colleagues at the department to remind me of what those pacing guides are for new teachers. I see you, Martha. And lastly, is the purpose of evaluations clearly articulated in the language above?
Before you get too far into this conversation, I want to push back on the word evaluate versus observe. In the teaching profession with team evaluation, that's a 3-pronged system with observation, growth, and achievement. An observation is the assessment of teaching practice. Evaluation is the combination of the multi-measure system. So I do not agree with your terminology around evaluate versus observe. However, I do live in this every single day, and I don't want to split a hair that is not worth splitting. But if we are going to consistently use language throughout policy, I would strongly ask that you reconsider using the term formally observe versus formally evaluate. Just put that out there. And yes, I can share the pacing guides for novice teachers if that's necessary.
Can you just remind us of the frequency, Martha? Just how many?
They would have 3 instruction, 2 planning, 2 environment, at least 90 minutes. Typically, that looks like 3 observations over the course of a school year. I don't know that is what I would suggest for candidates that are growing in their practice. And I will also say that I have a few concerns about norming around what we are doing with the team rubric with novice teachers that do not yet have a full toolkit of practices ready. But again, I do not live in the world of educator preparation. I live in the world of educator evaluation. So I am open to learning from my EPP colleagues what they feel is appropriate. Thank you,
Well,
Brooke.
I will say your perspective is highly valuable, and that was helpful. So other folks kind of on this evaluation versus observation. Oh, thanks, Brooke.
Yeah, the one question that I would have or concern potentially is on the observation of the candidates. If you're using team, our administrators go through team training and all that. These mentors would probably not have done that. So that would be a concern that I would have on how do we make sure that they are trained to use that observation instrument.
We can support that. And provide documentation that it's been successfully completed.
All right, we got some hands up. David.
Sorry, I just clicked the wrong button.
Okay,
there we are. All right. We used to do 5 once upon a time, and then we dropped it to follow the early career model that Martha was talking about. And thank you for that clarification. Now that was because of our partnership agreements and because our data aligned with our school partners reporting of their scores. So we were able to kind of check what are we giving, because there was a discussion out there, are we overinflating, if you will? And we actually found out we were underinflating, under.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, we found it the other way, which, and we used the team and give the formal because, there's a host out there in my faculty is going, what about Tiger Little coaches? And, we've just experienced that our pre-service folks, they like numbers. I mean, we do the grow and glows and the informals or the, you know, the little walkthroughs as well. But our pre-service likes numbers. It just kind of anchors them. And I appreciate Martha because that's what we require. All our supervisors get team certified. They upload that certificate, and that's how we ensure that they are meeting those things. And I think that's what really tries to keep us aligned with what our partners are experiencing on that day one or those first 3 years for our graduates. But so yeah, that's what we basically follow, the team guidelines on all of that.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the fidelity explanation around team, Martha. I think that's really important. We started using team with our candidates 3 years ago. We also find it, I appreciate that point, it's very challenging to navigate that as an observational tool with a pre-service candidate who did not have any education background. So that is usually 70% of our candidates. That language is not appropriate. The tool is unwieldy. It does not actually promote growth. We have to find ways to use that tool in a more discreet way. 5 formal observations feels wildly excessive given the amount of feedback that our candidates receive, but 5 observations would be wildly insufficient. And so our candidates, again, Monday through Thursday, have a clinical mentor's eyes on them, giving them feedback regularly, which is important observationally, not quite a formal observation, but at least 3 weeks have a clinical supervisor or coach, we call them coaches, but clinical supervisor, formally observing and debriefing their practice. And so it is not an evaluation system alone. And that isn't how team is built, but it is unwieldy for that speed, that depth of knowledge for a candidate. And it is not content specific enough in terms of our candidates when we need to talk about lesson planning and content specific strategies. And so, I mean, it provides, again, numbers, some like for our ed majors who come to us, that really pushes their practice. It provides a great standardization tool. It's really pushed our practice to think about an aligned tool, but it is, this is a lot.
And Megan, I do agree with that. The content specificity is not built into team because it's not designed for that. It is designed for instructional practice as opposed to content specific planning. So I hear your challenge in that, which is why those unique engagements with that clinical mentor, and I may have my words wrong again, I don't live in the EPP world, but with those supporting people, having those one-off conversation, moment-to-moment coaching conversations is where that massive growth is going to take place, not simply because of using the team rubric.
Which we document in our graduate release. So I feel like there's, like there's space to document. So this formal and observe and evaluate.
I'm also curious with the clinical permits. Again, if I am getting ahead of us or using the wrong terminology, but the people who are being identified as teacher of record as they are finishing their EPP work, how's this going to play in their world with the requirements of being a teacher of record and the requirements of being an EPP student?
They still would have to meet the requirements of the clinical practice, and that's true today, right? So whatever requirements the EPP has for clinical practice, including, observations and
Sure. And what are the challenges with that? And I see lots of hands, so maybe I need to be quiet and let you run through our questions.
No, that's okay. I mean, any EPP want to weigh in on how you're supporting candidates on a clinical practice permit?
We support ours just like we do any other student teaching candidate. They have to go through the same processes as everyone else. So they're evaluated the same. They have a, university supervisor and a clinical mentor.
Yeah, we as well. They get exactly the same experience in terms of supervision and mentoring.
I would say that we do as well, but one thing that I've noted is some candidates speaking to a number of administrative evaluations, district evaluations, other sort of kind of pop-up building evaluations that they struggle to manage, I think, between the student teaching requirements and more of what so we kind of look at their clinical practice permit as like the 2 full-time job role, right? And so there are their student teaching requirements in that role, and then there are their new teacher requirements in that role. And in my experience so far, not every CPP candidate has had the same approach taken with their new teacher kind of evaluation and responsibilities, though we have stayed consistent with their student teaching evaluation or observation responsibilities. So, and I know that might be a different conversation, but I would love to see a world where we somehow kind of match the EPP and district clarity on expectations around that for clinical practice permit candidates, so that, you know, as an EPP, we can better navigate how overwhelmed, particularly our candidates might become from balancing those two things.
Yeah. Okay, Ula, I know you had a comment.
Having one foot in our school system being a LEA-based EPP, I would like to point out that a lot of the districts do not pay their mentors for this additional role that they often take on in addition to their own full-time teaching job. And they often have more than just one mentee. It is a time-consuming additional responsibility if done well. And I myself had trouble actually this year finding mentors who fulfill all the requirements per policy, plus are team certified. Several of them took on that additional task to get certified, but it is, I mean, it's time consuming and not just a given or easy. So there's a potential to fail the team test. So some mentors may just not want to be willing to be a mentor again.
I know years ago the issue came up that mentors were concerned that supervising a candidate would negatively impact their own evaluation. And I hope that you all are communicating the research that has come out more than once now that shows that their evaluations either remain consistent or actually they see a bump. Which I think you could probably see the logic there, but that is, of course, I recognize that's a very challenging role for them to be in, and any way we can at the state level, you know, celebrate that or recognize that. And I know we've had some conversations around that for years. We certainly are advocating for doing so. Funding would be super helpful. Matt.
So I think one question that jumps off the page for me is like, well, to what end? And so like, so they do these 5 pieces. And so again, to like bring the focus back on kids is like, well, like what happens if the observation, like it's all one, and like this, you know, I think that falls on the EPP.
It
Like,
does.
and I think that's probably the reason why it's broad, but I think we should probably, you know, be clear there. And like, what role does the mentor play in that? And you know, I've seen mentor relationships go south and all of that kind of piece there. So there's some things I would want clarified before we make a change. And then I do like has been said, I'm just going to advocate for mentors. Like this would be one more thing on their plate, and they're asked to do a whole lot in the space. And like I think you know, we really should consider like how, like statewide, what are we considering the role of a mentor? And like, you know, we compensate them, like NTR does that, but like how can we do something more formal? I will push for something that shows up on their license on T Encompass. I would love to see that because like their work is like really matters. And I know like one of the reasons why people are leaving the profession is they don't see career advancement. And if we could like encourage people to grow and to want to pursue this role of being a mentor, and it shows up on their license like, hey, I'm a qualified mentor in the state of Tennessee. I think that would, carry some weight in the profession. So I think anytime we're talking about mentors, I think we got to balance the care and then also like raising the expectation.
Great points.
Can I jump in? And actually, Director Pruitt, if you're still on, does your LEA utilize strategic compensation to identify additional roles and responsibilities as a stipend or the stipend for mentor teachers in that?
We have strategic compensation. We have not used that as a source of giving that money, though. We have not used that as an identifier, I guess you could say.
Is that something that would be appealing to an LEA to lean into that for their supporting teachers?
It would be if there's additional funding coming from the state, but unless there's additional funding coming from the state, they're probably not going to spend that money there.
Or have you all been able to think about using Title II funds for that purpose?
Again, the amount of money we get from Title II funding is so limited. I just don't know that would be, and Dr. Stevens she can chime in too to vouch for it or maybe disagree with me.
Yes, please. I would love to hear that.
Same as you, Eddie. We have additional responsibilities within strategic compensation. Mentoring is not one of them. And we do use Title II for some of those opportunities for appropriate coaching, professional learning.
Dr. Stevens, you had something else I think you wanted to.
I wanted to echo the word evaluate versus observe. When seeing the word evaluate, and Martha stole my thunder right away, that did not hit well with me, because evaluation is a multi-pronged item. And I would say as an EPP, there may be other elements that an EPP would want to consider as a part of their evaluation of a candidate, and observations would certainly be one of them, right? The other thing I want to lift up, we're a project coach district. So our observations for an entering novice teacher is 8. The count is 8, and it's 130 minutes. And so it may be rooted around minutes that might be better than times, I suppose, because you do have state approved measures that are a bit different in nature. And so when looking at EPP agreements, my comment back to the universities is, instead of saying team, let's put in state approved measure, because we use a state approved measure. And we want to make sure that when our student teachers and interns are here, they are experiencing what their supervising teacher experiences, so they can have healthy conversations around that observation tool.
Super important points. I appreciate that, Dr. Stevens. We are running a little tight on time, so I want to kind of get right to the questions that have been batted around a little bit. Observe versus evaluate. Could you please just put in the chat which term do you prefer? And to this conversation around the frequency. So we put 5 in here based on that research-based NCTQ report. What would be your proposal? Whether that's a number or something else, please also put that in the chat.
Michael,
yes.
To the point of 5, one of the pieces I was thinking about, I pulled some data just from our current group. They had 5 in the first 8 weeks of the school year. And so I think like would a mentor then be like, all right, I've fulfilled this requirement. I continue it. And so I think like the spacing is important. And that language like probably should be in there.
Matt, you gave me some thoughts that I wrote down around kind of beefing some of this second sentence up a little bit. I wrote down EPPs shall determine how observations or evaluations, wherever this lands, are used to support candidate progression, and how evaluations are paced. I don't know that we would want to be that prescriptive on those issues at the state level, but it would send the signal that EPPs need to be intentional about it. I want to just note here, we've got some really strong folks on this call, 2 EPPs are, if you look at some of our teacher prep report card, EPPs are not all in the same place. And so I just want to acknowledge that we have some EPPs that may not be in the same place as some of the folks that are on this call and are sharing some of the really good practices that you engage in. So just want to, we have not said that, but that it kind of highlights the whole purpose of why we do this at the state level, is to set minimum requirements for some of these things so that every EPP can either meet or exceed those. Okay, so I want to keep us moving. Please continue throwing comments in the chat around frequency of observations and observations versus evaluation. The last two slides are around clinical practice settings, and let me just cut to the chase here. The proposal here is to get rid of the requirement that clinical practice has to happen in 2 settings and replace it with this language that gets more to the intent of why we recommended 2 settings in the first place, because that was partially my doing. Clinical experiences shall provide candidates with opportunities to engage with a variety of student populations, including students with diverse learning needs and from diverse backgrounds. That is the intent, right? And whether that happens, and let me also note that the word clinical experiences is used intentionally there. So it's not necessarily saying that your clinical practice has to take place in 2 settings, or rather has to expose candidates to all sorts of diversity, whether that be class, race, need, and that sort of thing. It is encompassing field experiences. So thoughts on this? I've heard a lot of chatter over the years around the challenges that the 2 settings requirement makes. I will say that, especially with the student teaching practice only being 15 weeks, splitting that up probably provides for some challenges related to continuity of experience. But any thoughts on this one?
I'll say I absolutely support the language. Would it be up to EPP interpretation as to what constitutes diverse learning needs or diverse backgrounds?
My assumption, and it probably already is part of your comprehensive review.
It is, but
yeah,
I'm just thinking about, and these are few and far between, but our candidates who have a placement in somewhere very rural.
Mm-hmm.
And what that looks like compared to some of our more common placements with our primary partner in MMPS.
Yep.
Okay.
I echo Megan's. I like that. It does that clarification, because I know historically we always interpreted setting as 2 different buildings, but that we got away from.
Be the case.
Yeah, and that's where we got away from, especially with our folks seeking dual endorsements or multiple endorsements, to still get the depth of a school, while having those opportunities to work with a variety of kiddos.
Yep.
So, thank you.
Anything else on this topic? Pretty straightforward. Okay. So this one I think is even more straightforward. We have current policy language that says for candidates enrolled in programs leading to more than 1 endorsement, the field experiences and clinical practice shall be divided among the content areas. That makes a whole lot of sense, right? If you're in a dual endorsement program, you need to have some exposure in both. But what we don't talk about, I don't think, unless somebody knows that we have this elsewhere and I'm just missing it, is for those folks who are seeking endorsement in really broad grade spans, K-12, even 6-12. We don't really have any language that specifies that they need to have some experiences across those grade spans. I don't think anybody wants somebody who is getting a K-12 endorsement to only spend their time in a 9th grade classroom. I certainly wouldn't. So are there any challenges with this proposed language or any recommendations to make it stronger? Okay. Yes, Ula.
I notice in the parentheses it says applies to all clinical practice types. Would this include job embedded? Because they are kind of locked into their job. And if it's a high school job, that's where they are. And they can't easily do their job embedded then also at a middle school. They can, though, go for their field experience and observe, for example, a teacher at middle school. That's how we handle it right now.
Yep, I think that would be
to cover that.
That would cover that. That would be sufficient. Your current structure.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we are limited on time and we've discussed a whole lot. So let me actually jump to next steps and then we'll come back and just kind of recap some of what was discussed and then give you all some time to surface anything that maybe we haven't talked about that you want to make sure we get on our agenda for the next meeting. So feedback from this committee on these issues will be shared with our executive director. If we bring policy recommendations, those will be proposed to the board in November on first reading, final reading in February. Additional feedback will be gathered between readings. This is not a one and done sort of thing. If you all want to now go forth and discuss some of these issues with your stakeholder groups and provide additional feedback, our timeline for getting red lines to our members is very tight for the November meeting, but we've got a fairly long on-ramp to our final recommendations or our final reading in February. So please do that. I know we've discussed a lot of issues here and we need to take your recommendations and sit down as a leadership team and with the department and kind of work through what some of this might mean and that sort of thing. But if you have any other topics you'd like to highlight for our next meeting, which I anticipate we will have in spring 2025, I feel like EdTPA was at the top of the list, and we seem to, at least from this group, have a fairly strong consensus around where you all would like to go. I will send this PowerPoint deck out because what I want you to do is go back through it with the lens of application to all clinical practice types, because that is not how this PowerPoint was designed initially, because that's not where our conversation went back in April. But given the course of this conversation, I want to give you an opportunity to revisit some of this on your own time and provide any additional feedback you may have out of state. That is always a big one, John. I appreciate that. David, love your list. All right. Anything else? And let me just do a kind of quick step back and recap. So this group is now sort of recommending that one, we have a gradual drop of the EdTPA requirement, both for internship and student teaching clinical pathways. And in all of these sort of more nuanced issues we've discussed related to clinical mentoring and observing and coursework and placements and that sort of thing, that we would potentially beef up both really all clinical practice pathways and include additional language in our policy to do that. And that would make you all, this committee at least, feel confident in dropping the EdTPA requirement. Does anybody on this call want to speak up and say, I don't agree with dropping EdTPA? All right. Well, if you are sitting here and you are not feeling great about that, again, please feel free to reach out with those comments and counterpoints. Anything else anyone would like to share? Any of my colleagues from the department?
Michael, I just want to say thank you to everybody. I've been pretty quiet, but sitting here taking it in and look forward to having those conversations. And if anybody shares any details with me, I'm happy to share them with Michael, vice versa, because we're all in this together. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. All right. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we will be in touch.